Just about 11 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is John Laffey, Technical Manager here at Perry Johnson Registrars, and today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about risk assessment considerations for your information security management system. Just a few quick notes. All participants are currently muted, but please use the question section of the GoToMeeting dashboard to ask any questions as you have them. And at the end of the presentation, I will go ahead and answer as many of those questions as I can. And we should have plenty of time because I usually end up running through these presentations fairly quickly. Copies of today's presentation will be available for download shortly after the conclusion of the presentation. And the webinar will also be available for viewing on our website, pjr.com, under the previously recorded webinars link. All right, so what we're going to be looking at today, obviously it's all focused in on that risk assessment requirement of ISO 27001, but we're going to be looking firstly at the context, approach, and criteria for risk management. Then we'd be taking a look individually at risk identification, risk analysis, risk evaluation. We're not going to get into the risk treatment in this presentation. I wanted to split them up, and that's what I'm planning on doing next is risk treatment, but just to keep it short enough that you know, we don't lose anybody's attention. So, and then after that, obviously, again, I'll be answering as many questions as I can here. So let's jump in. All right. Talking about context, approach, and criteria. So the internal and external context of your organization and the scope of your ISMS will obviously be key drivers in determining what criteria will be needed for risk evaluation, impact, and acceptance. As an example, contractual or regulatory requirements applicable to your organization could have a large influence on what your risk acceptance criteria will be. The risk assessment process should be reflective of the sector and the specific risks related to the organization, as well as the expectations of your stakeholders and the current threat landscape. So basically, it shouldn't take place in a vacuum. You know, it should very much take into consideration all those unique aspects of the business that you're in, the clients and customers that you have, the type of information that you deal with. You know, those are all things that obviously should be at the center of determining your risk criteria and acceptance. There are many different information security risk management strategies and approaches, and ISO 27001 does not prescribe that a particular one be used, which is a good thing because there's obviously many different ways to have an effective risk management process in place. There are a few requirements, however, that the standard talks about, one of which is that assessments be performed at planned intervals or whenever significant changes are proposed or are occurring. So basically, you know, it shouldn't just be kind of, we do them when we feel they need. You know, it should either be a set interval annually, semi-annually, etc. And then certainly with the provision that if we're going to be putting new systems into place, if we're integrating systems with a new acquisition, I mean, all these kinds of things that can have a big changing effect on your information systems in general. New risk assessment should be performed at that time, either holistically or at least covering the parts of the system that are changing. Again, the standard does not specify what the risk acceptance criteria should be. It does require that it's established and maintained. So, you know, basically that's to say it shouldn't just kind of be depending on the day and the weather and how the person who was performing the risk assessment felt that day, decision made on the spot whether or not it's acceptable. Although I will say, and I have seen, you know, a lot of times in the policy or procedure that talks about an organization's risk assessment process, they will put the provision in that certain high-level managers or executives can accept levels of risk that are above the threshold they've established for their acceptance criteria. But but obviously that has to be well documented. And the key thing is you just want to make sure that these people are well informed of exactly what level of risk they're exposing themselves to. Additionally, the standard also requires that risks associated with the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information be identified. So that's at the high level what we're looking at here for information security. We always go back to the CIA triad, so you want to keep that in mind. So confidentiality, only those people who need to see something can see it. Integrity, it should be not able to be changed or modified in any way except by authorized users. And then availability, so that can hit on a lot of things, but basically, can you access this information when it's needed to be accessed? Risk identification. ISO 27001 requires that, again, risks associated with the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability for information within the scope of the ISMS be identified. This can be an overwhelming task, especially if there's no formal approach or method that's been planned ahead of time for guiding the process. The standard does not require that a specific approach be used. For illustrative purposes, I will outline a commonly used method for assisting you with this task, one that I've read about myself and seen in action. But I just want to say that I'm not implying that this is the best method or the one that you should use. Again, there's a ton of different methods available, published, well-known ones, and obviously you're free to choose and kind of design your own as you see fit for your organization. Sometimes organizations will have like an enterprise-wide risk management system in place, and you'll see some alignment there then between the information security portion and the enterprise-wide one, just as a possible example. Wall of text. All right. So the first step in this method that I'm using, again, just for illustrative purposes, would be to identify the assets that are within the scope of the ISMS, keeping in mind that assets are not just hardware and software, but anything of value to the organization. For this example, let's assume that there are primary assets, business processes, and information, and supporting assets, which would be the hardware, software, network, personnel, sites, organizational structure, etc., that support those primary assets. By identifying the primary assets in the scope of the ISMS, then you can more easily identify the supporting assets which could potentially affect the confidentiality, integrity, and or availability of those primary assets. Identify an asset owner for all identified assets. This isn't specified in this particular section of the standard, but there is some Annex A controls that deal with asset management, and one of them certainly does talk about having asset owners assigned. This should be the person most appropriate for being responsible and accountable for the asset, so they need to be empowered enough to feel that they in fact are responsible and able to do whatever they deem necessary to be accountable for that asset. In many cases, the asset owner is going to be the best person suited to determine the asset's value to the organization. So if we're talking about networking equipment or something of that nature, it could very well be an operational manager in that space, but someone who's going to be able to best quantify the value of a given asset, because when you look at these things kind of holistically instead of just the price of an individual router, switch, etc., the actual value can be much greater than the sum of the purchase price. The next step is to then identify threats to the primary and supporting assets identified previously. Keeping in mind, again, threats may be accidental or deliberate and of natural or human origin. To ensure a comprehensive list is created as well as limit the magnitude of the work, consider using generic threat types such as unauthorized access, physical damage, technical failure, natural disaster, etc. Then where specific individual threats of a certain type warrant explicit identification, ensure that you do so. As far as what would warrant an explicit identification, I would say, keeping in mind the criticality of the asset they are associated with, as well as the level of damage they could cause if realized. So if it's, you know, physical damage to a computer monitor, I don't think you'd need to go and enumerate some specific scenario of whatever, a person accidentally drops it. However, if it were something like your customer's personally identifiable information being affected by unauthorized access, and there's some specific scenarios that you or your organization is concerned about, it's certainly worth enumerating those out individually to make sure that everything's considered. And again, in this whole process, you know, the main thing I'm looking for as an auditor is that no risks have been overlooked in terms of what your most critical information assets are. So, you know, I've spoken with people in the past who kind of get caught up about, well, how in depth do we need to go for each one of our assets if they're using a similar approach as I'm outlining here. And so that's the thing to keep in mind is your most critical information assets are the ones that need to be most thoroughly covered as far as potential risks. When determining threats, you know, consider soliciting input from as many resources as you have available to you. Examples would include asset owners, users, related staff members, legal departments, legal bodies, physical and informational security specialists, etc. The more complete threat listing you can generate, the more informed and protected you can be. You know, you don't know what you don't know, so all we can do in this part of the process is just try and lay as much on the table as possible for the powers that be to make the ultimate decisions. All right, continuing on. Identify existing controls already in place or planned to be implemented. This step may simply be a review of existing documentation, or if this is the initial iteration of the assessment, it could be a little bit more involved. If no existing control documentation exists, you'll need to check with the individuals responsible for information security, you know, security officers, building managers, operation managers, etc., to get a comprehensive list of controls already in place. Again, the primary objective of this step is to avoid wasting time or money by duplicating controls. You know, it's a daunting enough task. Nobody wants to go through all the work and propose and implement new controls only to find out that they were actually already there. And it's also good to know what you have, absolutely. So after completing this, you should have a list of all existing or planned controls, and you also want to discover and document their current implementation and usage status. So if there's a certain control that's in the process of being implemented, try and record, you know, what percentage of the way it's there. It's also a good idea to, if you can, have some timelines, have some dates when these are expected to be implemented, so they don't just hang out there indefinitely. Next, you want to identify vulnerabilities related to the identified assets. So vulnerabilities are weaknesses associated with assets or controls that can be exploited by one or more threats. There's a lot of resources available that can be used to assist with vulnerability identification, from just, you know, printed lists or documented lists that you can find on the internet of threats and associated vulnerabilities, to automated vulnerability scanners, penetration testing, code review. There's a lot of different avenues you can take here. And in a lot of cases, especially with the more technically bound vulnerabilities, having some kind of automated tool or scanner can be beneficial, because obviously they can be updated at a rapid rate as threats and vulnerabilities change quickly, which they do obviously in this arena. After performing this step, you should now have a list of vulnerabilities in relation to your assets, threats, and existing controls. ISO 27001 requires that a risk owner is identified for all risks, and these owners need to have the accountability and authority to manage their identified risks. I put that in here now. At this point in the example, you might not necessarily have the entire risk picture drawn yet, because we're still gathering some information, but once you do have that final list of risks, you certainly want to make sure that there's an individual assigned to be the owner of those risks, and they absolutely should be somebody who has the authority to take whatever action is determined to be needed in order to manage them. So to summarize, the goal of the identification process is to have a complete list of your information assets with their associated threats and vulnerabilities, and a listing of existing and planned controls as well as their implementation status. By gathering this information, you will be prepared to perform your risk analysis, which brings us to risk analysis. Again, there are many methods of risk analysis that can be used, and ISO 27001 does not require specific methodology be employed. Continuing with our example method, the next step is to identify consequences that the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and/or availability may have on the assets identified. Consequence being a loss of effectiveness, adverse operating conditions, loss of business, reputation damage, financial damage, etc. By taking the list of assets and associated threats and vulnerabilities, scenarios can be drawn up by describing a threat exploiting a vulnerability. The scenario should include operational consequences in terms of investigation and repair time, time lost, opportunity lost, health and safety, financial cost, image reputation, and goodwill. So basically, these scenarios would be just an explicit kind of description of, okay, we have firewall A in place, there's a known vulnerability, a threat would be an outside agent exploiting that vulnerability to gain access to our network and potentially our data. And then you could run down that list and kind of enumerate all the consequences that we just talked about. Depending on the approach adopted by your organization, a qualitative or quantitative risk analysis methodology may be in place. Briefly, a qualitative analysis approach will employ a more subjective rating system for potential consequences and likelihoods, example being low, medium, and high. A quantitative approach will use numerical values for consequences and likelihood. Each approach has its merits and can be effective methods of risk analysis. Obviously, I've seen both ends of the spectrum. I've seen some really complex quantitative approaches, which are great. And I've also seen some where the folks couldn't really even describe to me where these numbers were coming from or how they all kind of intermingled for the ultimate risk score. So you want to make sure that you choose something that obviously works for you and that you feel comfortable is representing these levels of risk most effectively for your organization. To determine the level of risk, the consequence and likelihood values are combined to assign a raw risk value. That's my term, a risk score, raw risk score. It's basically the level of risk that exists before you've factored in any existing or planned controls that may be mitigating it. So now with your risks and levels of risk identified, you can evaluate and prioritize them, which brings us to risk evaluation. ISO 27001 requires that organizations evaluate their risks by comparing the risk analysis results against the criteria for performing information security risk assessments, as well as the risk acceptance criteria that they have determined appropriate for their ISMS. The last step in the assessment process is to use the information gathered during the previous steps to make informed decisions and take action. The standard requires untreated risks that are beyond the established acceptable level of risk must be treated. Additionally, the risks must be prioritized for risk treatment. So basically, you've gone through all the legwork, you've identified all your assets, their threats, their vulnerabilities, you've ran through potential consequences, you've calculated likelihoods that these will occur. You've done the math, you've got some numbers, so you should at this point have a pretty clear picture of what your biggest risks are in whatever terms you've determined to be most appropriate when you determine your risk criteria. So now you take this in front of typically folks who, you know, the decision makers who don't want to get kind of bogged down in all the minutia, and it's a nice easy way to be able to present to them, look, see this right here, this risk high, you know, and then you could run through the potential consequences, we need to do something about this, etc., and down the list. But the important thing is that that you're treating anything that's above your acceptable level of risk that you've determined, and that they're being prioritized. So this is the biggest, we need to take care of this one first, this one next, so on and so forth. Additional considerations besides the established acceptable level of risk that may be used include the importance or criticality of the asset the risk is associated with, which typically is already going to be factored in, to your risk score. The degree of confidence in the risk assessment process, which is obviously a factor. This is all kind of best guess, and risk is uncertainty in general. So that has to be taken into account. And then contractual, legal, and regulatory requirements. If there's requirements that you have contractually or legal or regulatory that aren't being met, those, if they somehow were not above your acceptable risk level after the assessment, that they would still obviously need to be handled due to their nature. All right. And that was it. Fairly brief today. I'll open up the question box here and see if we have any takers. I'm not showing anything so far, so stick around for a little bit here. Feel free to type in any questions that you may have in that question box, and I'd love to do my best here to provide some answers. If there are no questions, though, I just want to thank everybody again for attending. If you're interested in ISO 27001 certification or further information in general, please give us a call at 1-800-800-7910, or feel free to reach out to me directly. My email is jlaffey@pjr.com. It should be right there on the screen as well. All right, we have a question here from Mark asking how this applies to ISO 9001. So Mark, this was more driven towards ISO 27001, but I do know that the latest revision of ISO 9001 did introduce risk and what they call risk-based thinking into the standard. As far as having to needing a process like the one I described for ISO 9001 purposes, that level of formality and sophistication isn't required. Really, all it wants to see is that there is risk-based thinking in place, which quite honestly can be shown in a number of ways. Anytime a decision was made, take for instance the management review. If it's clear that there is information there being discussed and decisions made, and that risk was taken into account, that in itself could satisfy the requirement for risk-based thinking. So, it's almost hard to, as an auditor, I would be hard-pressed to say that there was no risk-based thinking in place, because I think as human beings, that's just how we operate. If you touch a stove and it burns you, you don't touch it again because there's a risk associated with it. To follow up on 9001, how does it apply to 14,001? This is from Jenny. And Jenny, I'm sorry, but I have no experience with 14,001, so I can't say on that. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to dig into that standard, so I apologize. I just want to comment on a point here made by Sherry in the question box, who just said, FYI, if you already have ISO 9001 in place, you can use a lot of the work done to get 27001. And I would absolutely agree. The two standards are actually, they were kind of drawn up with integration being possible between the two. Clearly there's going to be a lot of commonality. Things like internal audits, management reviews are going to be common to both. And just the experience that an organization would have becoming 9001 certified, kind of that level of formalization in their processes and procedures that's required, all of that certainly lends itself to 27001. So absolutely great point there, Sherry. Just wanted to share that with everybody. Mark, absolutely. Thank you for attending. I hope it was helpful to you, and thanks for the feedback as well. Question from Paulo here, is it possible to get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation? And yes, I do believe that the slideshow will be available for download on our website, which typically, if not by the end of the day today, it should be up tomorrow. No problem, Paul. And Mark, again, thank you. It's nice to hear some positive feedback, always. All right, just gonna stick around here for a few more minutes, see if anything else comes up, and if not, I'll go ahead and shut her down. And again, thank you all for attending. I'm going to continue to do these. As I said earlier, I believe my next presentation is going to be about the risk treatment process. So kind of the other half of this. Now that we have all these risks, how do we go about not only taking care of them, but documenting them and being able to show what we're doing in a way that is required by ISO 27001. Typically we do them, I've been trying to do them once a month, Paulo. So I have to double check my calendar. I know I have some audits coming up that's going to pull me away from the office, but I know certainly as soon as it's firmed up, we'll send emails out, like we did for this one. And you can also always check on our website, pjr.com. Which I think I can pull up real quick. Upcoming webinars is a link that we have that gives all that information. So under the training tab here at the top, there's a upcoming webinars link, and this will show everything that's on the books and is updated on a continuous basis. So feel free to always come by our website and check this page out to see what's coming. You know, we have stuff covering 13485, always 9001 is on there a lot, AS 9100 aerospace, so all that good stuff. No problem, Paula. All right, well, I think that's going to wrap it up for today. Again, thank you all, and I will look forward to seeing you all again when we talk about risk treatment in a month or so. Have a great day.